Hands where I can see them, ma'am. The words cut through the low hum of the gas station like a switch, flipping the entire place into silence. And for a second, even the flickering neon above pump number 4 seemed to hesitate, as Naomi Carter slowly turned her head, her hand still resting on the cold metal of the pump handle, the scent of gasoline hanging sharp in the late evening air, her breath steady, her eyes calm, not surprised, not confused, just tired in a way that didn't show on her face, but lived somewhere deeper. Somewhere quieter, as the red and blue lights painted the concrete in slow, pulsing waves, reflecting off the chrome of parked cars and the glass doors of the convenience store where a few customers had already stopped mid-step, watching, phones subtly rising, curiosity filling the gaps where understanding should have been, and Officer Ryan Blake stepped closer, boots firm against the pavement, posture rigid, voice carrying that practiced authority that didn't need to be loud to be absolute. "Step away from the vehicle," he added, and Naomi complied without a word, placing the pump back with a soft click, the kind of small sound that somehow echoed louder than it should have, her movements measured, deliberate, as if she understood something the rest of the scene hadn't caught up to yet, as if she had already seen how this moment would unfold long before anyone else realized they were part of it. And when she turned fully to face him, the overhead light caught the edge of her cheekbone, soft but steady, her hands visible, relaxed at her sides, not raised, not defensive, just present, and that alone seemed to unsettle him more than resistance ever could, because there was no chaos to control, no panic to manage, just stillness, and stillness had a way of exposing things people preferred to keep buried. "License and registration," he said, though his eyes had already moved past her, scanning the car. The interior, the details that would confirm whatever assumption had already formed in his mind before he even stepped out of his cruiser, and Naomi nodded once, slow, respectful, reaching into her bag without sudden motion, pulling out her wallet, her fingers brushing briefly against a folded receipt, a set of keys, ordinary things that suddenly felt like evidence simply because of who held them, and as she handed over the ID, their fingers didn't touch, not even by accident. The distance between them carefully maintained like an unspoken rule, and somewhere behind them a car door shut. A child's voice asked a question that went unanswered, the world continuing in fragments while this moment held everything else in suspension, and Blake glanced at the license, his expression unreadable, then back at her, then again at the license as if the name printed there carried more weight. Then the woman standing in front of him. "Naomi Carter," he read aloud, testing it, measuring it, and she met his gaze without challenge, without submission, just acknowledgement, and for a brief second something flickered across his face, not doubt, not yet, but something close enough to it that it made him straighten slightly, adjusting his stance as if correcting a balance he hadn't realized was off. "Step to the side," he said, gesturing toward the hood of the patrol car, and she moved, each step quiet against the pavement, her shoes making soft contact with the ground, the kind of detail no one would remember later except the ones who noticed everything. And when she reached the front of the cruiser, the lights reflected in her eyes, not distorting them, just layering color over calm, and she placed her hands gently on the cool surface, not because she was told to, but because it seemed to make the moment easier for everyone else. And Blake circled around, his radio crackling, briefly with a voice that didn't quite form words before cutting out again, static filling the space where clarity should have been, and he spoke again, sharper this time. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area," and Naomi's lips parted slightly, not to argue, not to protest, but to ask, quietly, evenly, "What kind of activity?" And the question didn't challenge him, it didn't accuse, it simply existed, and somehow that made it heavier than anything louder ever could have been. And for a moment he didn't answer, his eyes narrowing just enough to suggest he wasn't used to being asked for explanation in a tone that carried no fear, no anger, just expectation, and behind them the hum of the station returned in fragments. The buzz of electricity, the distant rumble of a passing truck, the faint chime of the store door opening and closing, life continuing around a moment that felt like it had stopped, and Naomi remained still, her hands resting lightly, her posture straight, her breathing slow and controlled, as if she understood that the real tension wasn't in what had already happened, but in what was about to, and somewhere in the distance, far beyond the reach of the flashing lights and the quiet judgment of strangers, something else had already begun to move, unseen, unheard, but inevitable, like a clock that had just started ticking down. The metal of the hood felt colder now, not because the temperature had dropped, but because the moment had settled into something heavier, something that stretched time thin as Officer Blake stepped back just enough to speak into his radio, his voice low, controlled, but edged with something that did not quite belong to routine procedure. And Naomi remained still, her fingers resting lightly against the smooth surface, her eyes not fixed on any one point but aware of everything at once. The shifting weight of the people watching, the faint glow of phone screens angled just slightly away to pretend discretion, the hum of the overhead lights flickering in uneven intervals like a heartbeat that could not find its rhythm. And when the radio answered him, it was not with clarity, but with static first, a crackle that filled the air between words as if even the signal hesitated to commit to what was happening. Dispatch. I have a situation, he said, choosing each word carefully, and Naomi listened without appearing to, her breathing steady, her shoulders relaxed, not because she did not understand the seriousness of the moment, but because she understood it too well, because she had seen how quickly assumptions could turn into actions, and how actions could carry consequences long after the moment itself had passed. And a man near the entrance shifted his stance, whispering something under his breath to the woman beside him, who nodded slightly, their eyes never leaving Naomi, as if trying to solve a puzzle they had already decided the answer to. And Blake turned back toward her, his gaze sharper now, more deliberate. You said you were just passing through? He asked, and Naomi lifted her eyes to meet his, calm and direct. Yes, she replied, her voice even, not defensive, not hurried, just true, and the simplicity of it seemed to frustrate something in him that could not be resolved with a single word. Where are you coming from? He pressed, and she answered without hesitation, naming a town over 200 miles away, the kind of distance that made people question why someone would be here at this hour, at this place, alone. And Blake nodded once, though it did not look like agreement, more like a note being filed somewhere behind his expression. And he moved toward the vehicle, peering inside, his flashlight cutting through the dim interior, sweeping across the passenger seat, the dashboard, the small personal details that made up a life reduced to objects. A water bottle, a folded jacket, a notebook with a pen clipped neatly to the cover. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming, just ordinary. And yet the search continued as if ordinary itself required verification, and Naomi watched him without turning her head, her eyes tracking only slightly, her posture unchanged, and in that stillness there was something that did not fit the narrative forming around her, something that refused to align with the assumptions pressing in from every direction. And when he stepped back from the car, his jaw tightened just enough to be noticeable. Step back here, he instructed again, though she had not moved, and she complied with a small shift, the sound of her shoes against the pavement soft but precise. And for a brief moment their shadows crossed under the flashing lights, red blending into blue, neither color holding dominance for long. And Blake reached for his cuffs, not abruptly, not forcefully, but with the kind of practiced motion that suggested this was simply the next step, the expected progression. And Naomi lowered her gaze slightly to watch his hands, not in fear, but in acknowledgement of what was happening. And as the cool metal circled her wrists, the click echoed louder than it should have, sharp against the quiet, final in a way that made several onlookers shift. Uncomfortably, though none stepped forward, none spoke. The line between observation and involvement firmly held, and Naomi's fingers curled slightly as the cuffs settled, not resisting, just adjusting. And Blake guided her gently, but firmly toward the side of the cruiser, his touch controlled, measured, as if aware of the eyes on him, the silent witnesses documenting every movement. And Naomi followed without hesitation, her steps steady, her expression unchanged. And when she spoke again, it was softer than before, almost lost beneath the hum of the station. Officer, you might want to verify before this goes any further. And he paused, just for a fraction of a second, enough to register the words but not enough to accept them. I am verifying, he replied, though his tone carried less certainty than it had moments earlier, and he turned away again, reaching for his radio once more. this time pressing the button longer, waiting for a response. That did not come immediately, and the silence that followed stretched wider than before, filling the space between them with something unspoken, something building. And Naomi stood there with her hands secured, her posture straight, her presence unshaken, as if the situation unfolding around her was not something happening to her, but something revealing itself through her and somewhere beyond the edge of the gas station, beyond the reach of the flickering lights and the quiet judgment of strangers. A shift had already begun, subtle but undeniable, like a current moving beneath still water, unseen but impossible to stop once it started. The radio stayed quiet longer than it should have, long enough for the air to shift from tension into something heavier, something that pressed against the edges of the moment like a question waiting to be answered, and Officer Blake's thumb hovered over the button as if pressing it again might force clarity out of silence. But when he finally spoke, his voice carried a different weight, less certain, more measured. Dispatch. Confirm status on vehicle check. And Naomi listened to the slight change in tone, not reacting outwardly, but noting it the way someone notices a crack in glass before it spreads, subtle but real. And behind them the low murmur of the onlookers grew just enough to be felt, not loud enough to interrupt, but present, like a background current that refused to disappear. And one of the phones tilted slightly, adjusting its angle to capture her face more clearly. The reflection of the flashing lights moving across her skin in slow waves, red, then blue, then red. Again, and Naomi shifted her weight just slightly from one foot to the other, the cuffs resting against her wrists, cool and unyielding, not painful, just there, a reminder of the assumption that had already been made, and she lifted her gaze toward the horizon beyond the station, where the dark outline of the highway stretched out under a sky that held no answers, only distance. And when the radio finally responded, the voice on the other end sounded rushed, clipped, as if it had been pulled into the moment without preparation. Stand by, it said, and then silence again, shorter this time, but sharper, like something was happening just out of reach. And Blake's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking briefly toward Naomi before returning to the cruiser, as if trying to reconcile two versions of the same situation, one that made sense and one that did not. And Naomi spoke again, her voice low, steady. You are looking for something that is not there. And he did not respond immediately, but the pause that followed was longer than before, and when he finally did speak, it was quieter, almost as if the words were meant more for himself than for her. We will see about that. And he turned slightly, stepping toward the driver's side door, opening it with a firm motion, the interior lights spilling out across the pavement, illuminating the dust on the floor mat, the stack of forms on the seat, the small details of a system built on procedure. And he reached inside, retrieving a tablet mounted near the console, tapping the screen with practiced familiarity, pulling up information that should have confirmed everything, should have aligned the moment with expectation. And Naomi watched the reflection of the screen in the windshield, not reading it, but sensing the shift in his posture as he scrolled, as he paused, as his fingers slowed, and somewhere behind them a car engine started, then stopped again, the driver choosing to stay, to watch, to witness whatever came next. And Blake leaned slightly against the open door, his attention fixed on the screen, his breathing measured but no longer steady. And the radio crackled again, this time louder, sharper, cutting through the air with a suddenness that made several people glance toward the cruiser. Unit, confirm identity again, the voice said, and Blake straightened, his grip tightening around the edge of the door. Naomi Carter, he replied, each word clear, deliberate. And there was a pause on the other end, longer than before, filled with a kind of silence that did not belong to routine communication, a silence that carried weight. And Naomi felt it too, not as sound, but as a shift in the space around her, the way the air changes just before a storm breaks, subtle but undeniable. And Blake's eyes moved back to her, not with suspicion now, but with something closer to uncertainty. And he pressed the radio again, confirming Naomi Carter. He repeated, as if saying it twice might stabilize something that had begun to move beneath the surface. And the response came back slower this time, each word spaced, just enough to suggest careful selection. Stand by, do not proceed further. And the phrase lingered in the air longer than it should have, its meaning expanding beyond the simple instruction it appeared to be, and Blake lowered the radio slightly, his gaze fixed on Naomi in a way that was no longer about control, but about understanding, and for the first time since the moment began, he did not speak immediately. And Naomi met his eyes, calm, steady, her voice soft but clear when she finally said, "I told you." And the words did not carry accusation, did not carry triumph, only truth, and the stillness that followed was different now, not empty, not tense, but full, like something had shifted just enough to reveal the shape of what was coming next, and in the distance, far beyond the reach of the gas station lights, something else was already in motion, something faster, something that did not wait, something that did not ask for permission to arrive. The words "do not proceed further" did not fade when the radio went silent. They lingered in the air like something physical, something that settled between them and refused to be ignored. And Officer Blake stood there with the device still in his hand, his posture no longer anchored in certainty, but suspended in a space that did not have clear rules. And for the first time since he stepped out of his cruiser, he looked at Naomi Carter not as a situation to manage, but as a person he might not fully understand. And that shift, subtle as it was, changed the entire weight of the moment, because control depends on clarity, and clarity had just been taken away from him. And Naomi remained where she was, her wrists still secured, her shoulders relaxed, her gaze steady, not pressing, not retreating, simply present in a way that made everything else feel louder by comparison. And behind them the soft murmur of the onlookers had quieted again, not because interest had faded, but because something had shifted in a way they could feel without being able to explain, like a story turning before the audience realizes it has changed direction. And Blake lifted the radio again, pressing the button with more intent this time. "Dispatch. Clarify instruction," he said, his voice controlled but carrying an edge that had not been there before. And the response did not come immediately, and that delay stretched longer than any of the previous ones, long enough for doubt to move from the background into the center of his thoughts. And Naomi watched him without moving, her eyes not fixed on him directly, but aware of every detail, the slight tightening of his jaw, the way his grip on the radio shifted, the subtle change in how he stood. And when the response finally came, it was different, not rushed, not uncertain, but precise, measured. "Unit, hold position. Do not escalate. Supervisor en route." And the phrasing carried weight, the kind of weight that did not need explanation to be understood. And Blake lowered the radio slowly, his gaze drifting back to Naomi. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence between them no longer tense but loaded, like something was being decided without words. And Naomi broke that silence not with force but with quiet clarity. "You still have time to adjust this," she said, her voice calm, steady, and the words did not accuse him, did not challenge him. They simply existed, offering a path that had not been there a few minutes ago. And Blake exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cool night air, and he glanced toward the cruiser, then toward the small group of people watching, then back at Naomi, as if weighing something that extended beyond procedure, beyond protocol, something personal, something internal. And he stepped closer, not aggressively, not with the authority he had shown before, but with a kind of careful intention. And he looked at the cuffs around her wrists, then at her face, and for a brief moment it seemed like he might say something different, something that acknowledged the shift that had already begun. But instead he asked, quieter than before, "Why did you not say anything sooner?" And Naomi's expression did not change, but there was a softness in her eyes that had not been there before, not sympathy, not pity, but understanding. "Because you were not listening then," she replied. And the simplicity of the answer landed heavier than any argument could have. And Blake looked away, just for a second, his gaze dropping to the pavement where the reflections of the lights moved in slow, distorted patterns, and somewhere in the distance the faint sound of another vehicle approached, not fast, not loud, but steady, deliberate, and it carried with it a presence that could be felt before it was seen. And the onlookers shifted again, some turning their heads toward the road, others lowering their phones slightly, as if sensing that whatever came next would not belong to them. And Blake straightened, his posture adjusting once more, but not back to what it had been, not fully, because something had already changed, something that could not be reversed by standing a little taller or speaking a little louder. and Naomi followed the sound of the approaching vehicle with her eyes, her gaze lifting slightly, and for the first time since the moment began, there was the faintest shift in her expression, not relief, not satisfaction, just recognition, as if she had been expecting this, as if she had known that the moment would not end here, not in confusion, not in assumption, but in something else entirely, and the headlights appeared at the edge of the station, cutting through the darkness with a steady beam, not flashing, not urgent, but purposeful, and as the vehicle turned into the lot, the air seemed to settle into a different kind of stillness, one that did not carry tension but resolution, and Blake's grip on the radio loosened, his shoulders lowering just slightly, and Naomi stood there, unchanged in posture, unchanged in presence, as if the entire sequence of events had not altered her, but revealed something about everything else instead. And in that quiet, under the hum of the lights and the distant sound of tires against asphalt, the balance of the moment shifted completely, not with noise, not with force, but with the unmistakable weight of something undeniable arriving exactly when it was meant to. The vehicle rolled to a slow, deliberate stop near the edge of the gas station, its engine humming low like it had no need to announce itself. And for a moment no one moved, not the small crowd, not Officer Blake, not even Naomi, as if the entire scene had paused to acknowledge something had just shifted beyond their control. And when the driver's door opened, it was not rushed, not forceful, just precise, and a man stepped out in a dark uniform that carried a presence without needing to display it, his posture straight, his movements measured, and the way he closed the door behind him was quiet but final, like a period placed at the end of a sentence no one had finished reading yet. And Blake straightened instinctively, his shoulders pulling back, his stance adjusting in a way that was no longer about asserting authority but recognizing it. And the man approached without hurry, his eyes scanning the scene once, taking in everything, the cruiser, the lights, the onlookers, Naomi standing with her hands secured, and then settling on Blake. "Officer," he said, his voice calm, level, but carrying a weight that did not need to be explained, and Blake nodded quickly. "Yes, sir." The response coming faster than anything he had said before, and Naomi watched the exchange without shifting, her expression unchanged, but her eyes attentive, aware of the subtle recalibration happening in real time, and the man's gaze moved to her, not with suspicion, not with judgment, but with recognition. And for a brief second something softened in his expression, not familiarity exactly, but certainty, and he stepped closer, stopping just short of her, his eyes flicking briefly to the cuffs before returning to her face. "Ma'am," he said, and the single word carried more respect than anything spoken since the moment began, and Naomi inclined her head slightly, acknowledging it without exaggeration, without relief, just acceptance, and Blake shifted his weight, his hand lowering fully from the radio now, his voice quieter when he spoke again. "Dispatch said to hold position," he offered, as if explaining himself, as if trying to anchor what had already begun to drift, and the man nodded once, not dismissive, not approving, just acknowledging the statement for what it was. "You did," he replied, and the phrasing was simple, but the tone carried something else, something that suggested the situation had already moved beyond that instruction, and he turned slightly toward Blake, his eyes steady. "Remove the restraints," he said, not loudly, not sharply, but with a clarity that left no room for interpretation, and for a fraction of a second Blake hesitated, not out of defiance, but out of the habit of needing confirmation, and then he stepped forward, his hands moving to the cuffs, the metal cool against his fingers as he unlocked them, the click this time softer, less final, more like something being undone rather than imposed, and Naomi's wrists separated slowly, her hands lowering naturally to her sides, her fingers flexing once, subtle, controlled, as if resetting something that had never truly been shaken, and Blake stepped back immediately, the space between them widening in a way that felt different now, no longer defined by control, but by consequence, and the man in uniform watched the exchange without comment, his attention shifting back to Naomi. "Are you all right?" he asked, and she met his gaze, her voice calm, steady. "I am," she said, and the answer did not carry accusation, did not carry complaint, only truth, and the simplicity of it seemed to settle something in the air, something that had been building since the first moment of tension, and behind them the onlookers had grown quieter, some lowering their phones completely now, the need to capture replaced by the realization that what they were witnessing was not spectacle, but something more precise, more controlled, and Blake exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just slightly, his gaze dropping, briefly before returning to Naomi, and when he spoke again, his voice carried none of the earlier certainty, only a careful awareness of what had changed. "Ma'am," he began, and the word felt different coming from him now, not automatic, not assumed, but chosen, and Naomi looked at him, not with expectation, not with judgment, just with the same steady presence she had held from the beginning. And the silence between them stretched just enough to make the moment real, to make the shift undeniable. And in the distance, beyond the edge of the station, the faint glow of additional headlights appeared, not flashing, not urgent, but moving with purpose, and the man in uniform glanced toward them briefly, then back to Naomi, as if confirming that what had begun here was not isolated, not contained, but part of something larger already in motion. And Naomi stood there, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, as if she had never been out of place, as if the entire moment had only revealed what had been true all along. And under the hum of the lights and the quiet of the night, the balance of the scene settled into something new, something that no longer belonged to assumption, but to recognition. The second set of headlights did not rush into the scene. They arrived with a quiet certainty, gliding across the pavement before coming to a smooth stop just beyond the first vehicle. And the difference was immediate, not in sound, not in speed, but in presence, the kind that shifted attention without demanding it. And as the engine powered down, the air seemed to settle into a new kind of stillness, one that no longer carried confusion but anticipation. And Officer Blake turned slightly, his posture adjusting again, not rigid this time, not defensive, but aware, as if he understood that whatever came next would not follow the pattern he was trained to expect. And Naomi Carter stood where she was, her hands now free at her sides, her wrists still marked faintly by the pressure of the cuffs, but her posture unchanged, her breathing even, her expression calm in a way that did not need to prove anything to anyone watching. And the door of the second vehicle opened with a soft, controlled motion, and another figure stepped out, dressed not in patrol uniform but in a tailored suit that caught the light differently, absorbing it rather than reflecting it. And the man paused briefly, scanning the scene with a level gaze that did not linger on any one detail, yet seemed to register everything at once. The positioning of the cruiser, the stance of the officer, the distance between people, the quiet tension still lingering in the air. And then his eyes moved to Naomi, and something in his expression shifted, subtle but unmistakable, recognition layered with respect, and he approached without hurry, his steps measured, deliberate, each one carrying the weight of purpose rather than urgency. And as he drew closer, the first man in uniform stepped slightly aside, not out of obligation but acknowledgement, creating a clear path that had not been there moments ago. And Blake followed the movement instinctively, stepping back just enough to give space, his hands now resting loosely at his sides, no longer occupied by radio or restraint. And the suited man stopped a few feet from Naomi, his posture straight but not imposing, his voice calm when he spoke. "Ma'am." And the word carried a quiet authority that did not need to raise itself to be heard. And Naomi met his gaze, her eyes steady, and for the first time since the situation began, there was a faint warmth in her expression, not relief, not triumph, but recognition returned, and she nodded once, small, controlled, and the man's attention shifted briefly to Blake, not confrontational, not accusatory, just precise. "What do you have so far?" he asked, and Blake hesitated for the briefest moment, not because he did not have an answer, but because the answer no longer felt complete. "Suspicious activity report," he said, his voice even but quieter than before. "Vehicle flagged." And the suited man listened without interruption, his gaze steady, and when Blake finished, there was a pause, not long, but deliberate, the kind that allowed the weight of the words to settle before responding. And then the man spoke again. "And what did you verify?" And the question was simple, but it landed differently, not as a challenge, not as a test, but as a reflection of the process itself. And Blake glanced briefly at Naomi, then back at the man, "Name confirmed," he said, and the man nodded once, his expression unchanged. "Yes," he replied, and then his eyes returned to Naomi. And the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of something unspoken, something understood between them without needing explanation. And behind them the onlookers had grown still, their earlier curiosity replaced by a quiet awareness that the moment had moved beyond speculation, that whatever they thought they were witnessing had shifted into something else entirely. And Naomi drew a slow breath, her shoulders rising and falling almost imperceptibly, and when she spoke, her voice was as steady as it had been from the beginning. "This did not have to go this far," she said, and the words were not directed at anyone specifically, yet they reached everyone present, and Blake lowered his gaze slightly, not in defeat, not in shame, but in recognition of something he had not seen clearly before, and the suited man remained still for a moment, then inclined his head slightly, as if acknowledging the truth in her words without needing to confirm it aloud. And in the distance, far beyond the edge of the gas station, the faint hum of additional vehicles could be heard, not approaching quickly, not flashing lights, just moving steadily, like a sequence already set into motion. And Naomi stood there, her presence unchanged, her calm unbroken, as if the entire moment had only revealed what she already knew, that power does not always arrive with noise, and that sometimes the quietest presence in the room is the one that reshapes everything without ever raising its voice. The air held its breath in a way that no one could quite explain, not because something loud was about to happen, but because something quiet already had, and the suited man did not move immediately after Naomi spoke. He simply stood there, absorbing the weight of her words as if they were not directed at a single person, but at the entire moment itself. And then he shifted slightly, just enough to change the alignment of the scene, his presence anchoring it in a way that made everything else feel less certain. And Officer Blake remained where he was, his shoulders no longer squared with the same rigid certainty, his stance softer now, as if he was no longer trying to control the situation but understand it. And Naomi Carter stood in the center of it all, unchanged, her posture steady, her expression calm, the faint imprint of the cuffs still visible on her wrists but already fading into something less physical and more symbolic. And the suited man turned his attention back to Blake, his voice low but clear. "What initiated the report?" he asked. And the question did not carry accusation, but it carried expectation, the kind that required more than a surface answer. And Blake hesitated for a moment, his eyes shifting briefly toward the cruiser, then toward the small group of onlookers, and finally back to the man. "Caller flagged unusual behavior," he said, choosing his words carefully now, aware that each one carried more weight than before. And the suited man nodded once, not dismissing the explanation but not fully accepting it either. And he glanced toward Naomi again, then back to Blake. "And you confirmed that behavior?" he asked, and the question landed differently this time, not as procedure, but as reflection. And Blake's jaw tightened slightly, his gaze lowering just enough to acknowledge the gap between what had been assumed and what had actually been verified. And he did not answer immediately. And that silence said more than any explanation could have. And Naomi watched the exchange without interruption, her presence steady, her breathing even, as if she understood that the moment had moved beyond her actions and into something larger, something that was now unfolding between the people around her. And in the distance the faint hum of additional vehicles grew, slightly louder, not intrusive, not urgent, but consistent, like a current that had already been set in motion. And the suited man took a slow breath, his posture remaining composed, and when he spoke again, his tone carried a quiet finality. "Perception is not confirmation," he said, and the words settled into the space between them with a clarity that did not need to be repeated. And Blake nodded once, a small movement, but genuine, and he shifted his weight again, stepping slightly to the side, creating a clearer line of sight between Naomi and the man, as if recognizing that the center of the moment no longer belonged to him. And Naomi lifted her gaze slightly, meeting the suited man's eyes, and for a brief second there was a silent exchange that carried more understanding than any spoken words could have. And he inclined his head just slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement, not formal, not exaggerated, but precise. And then he turned his attention outward, scanning the perimeter of the station, the onlookers, the vehicles, the environment that had become part of the moment whether they intended to or not, and the crowd responded without being told. A few people lowering their phones completely, others stepping back just enough to create space, as if something unspoken had shifted their role from observers to witnesses, and Naomi exhaled slowly, the breath barely visible but enough to mark the passage of the moment, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the same calm clarity. "This happens more often than people think," she said, and the statement did not accuse, did not dramatize, it simply existed, and that made it heavier. And Blake looked at her then, really looked at her, not as a subject of a report, not as a situation to manage, but as a person standing in front of him, and something in his expression shifted again. Deeper this time, more personal, as if he was seeing not just her, but the pattern she represented, and he nodded once more, slower this time, as if acknowledging something he could not fully articulate, and the suited man remained still for a moment longer, then spoke quietly. "Then tonight, it stops here." And the words did not rise in volume, but they carried a weight that settled across the entire scene. And in the distance, the approaching vehicles slowed as they neared the station, their presence no longer building tension but closing it. And Naomi stood there, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, as if she had never needed the moment to resolve for herself, only for it to be seen clearly for what it was. And under the soft hum of the lights and the quiet of the night, the balance of everything shifted once more, not through force, not through volume, but through the simple act of recognition. And that recognition, once it arrived, did not leave. The words "then tonight it stops here" did not echo. They settled, firm and quiet, like something placed exactly where it belonged. And for a moment no one moved, not because they were unsure, but because the scene had shifted into something that required stillness to fully register. And Naomi Carter stood at the center of it, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, as if she had not been waiting for the moment to resolve, only for it to be seen clearly. And Officer Blake remained a few steps away, his hands now empty, his shoulders lowered just enough to reveal the tension that had been there before. And he looked at Naomi again, not quickly, not in passing, but with intention, as if trying to understand something that could not be written into a report or summarized over a radio call. And the suited man turned slightly, his attention moving outward toward the vehicles that had now come to a stop along the edge of the station, their engines idling softly, not intrusive, not demanding, just present. And the doors of those vehicles remained closed for a moment, as if whatever had arrived did not need to rush into the space, because the shift had already begun without it. And the quiet hum of the station filled the gaps between breaths, the buzz of the overhead lights, the distant sound of tires on asphalt, the faint click of someone locking their car across the lot, all of it grounding the moment in something real, something ordinary, even as everything about it felt anything but. And Naomi exhaled slowly, the breath soft, controlled, her fingers flexing once at her sides, not from discomfort, but from release. And when she looked toward Blake again, her gaze held no accusation, no anger, just clarity. And that clarity seemed to land heavier than anything else that had been said. And Blake shifted slightly, his weight moving from one foot to the other. And when he spoke, his voice was quieter than it had been at any point before. "Ma'am," he said again, but this time the word carried something different, not just respect, but recognition. And he paused, not because he did not know what to say, but because he understood that what he said next mattered in a way it had not before. And Naomi waited, not pressing him, not guiding him, just allowing the moment to exist as it was. And the suited man watched the exchange without interruption, his presence steady, not imposing, but anchoring. And in the background, one of the newly arrived vehicles powered down completely, the soft hum fading into silence, and a door opened quietly, another figure stepping out, remaining near the vehicle, not approaching, not intervening, simply observing with the same composed awareness that seemed to define everything that had arrived with them. And Blake drew a breath, steadying himself, and when he spoke again, the words came slower, more deliberate. There was not enough to justify what happened, he said, and the admission was not loud, not dramatic, but it was clear, and that clarity shifted something in the air once more, something that did not need to be acknowledged to be felt. and Naomi inclined her head slightly, not in approval, not in forgiveness, but in acknowledgement of the truth. And the suited man nodded once as well, his gaze moving briefly between them before settling again. And for a moment the three of them stood in a quiet alignment that had not existed at the start of the scene, not divided by roles or assumptions, but connected by understanding, however incomplete it might still be. And the onlookers, once eager to capture every second, had grown still, many lowering their phones entirely. Now, as if recognizing that what they were witnessing was not something to be consumed, but something to be respected, and Naomi looked out toward the road again, the dark stretch of highway beyond the station, and when she spoke, her voice was soft, but carried clearly. "Moments like this do not begin where people think they do," she said, and the words lingered, not as explanation, but as perspective, and Blake listened, his expression shifting again, not defensive, not uncertain, but thoughtful, as if the moment was continuing to unfold within him even as it settled around them. And the suited man remained still, his posture unchanged, his presence steady, as if ensuring that what had shifted here would not quietly return to what it had been before. And in the distance, the faint movement of headlights passed along the highway, continuing forward, unaffected, the world moving on as it always did. And yet here, under the glow of the station lights, something had been seen, something had been named, and something had been corrected, not through force, not through escalation, but through the quiet insistence of truth. And Naomi stood there, her presence unchanged, her calm unbroken, as if she had always known that the moment would come to this, not because it had to, but because it could. And in that quiet certainty, the scene found its balance, not perfect, not complete, but real enough to matter. The moment did not end when the words were spoken. It lingered, stretching quietly into something deeper, something that settled into the space between everyone present. And Naomi Carter stood still beneath the soft hum of the overhead lights, her hands relaxed at her sides, her posture unchanged, as if she had never been out of alignment with the moment, only waiting for it to catch up to her. And Officer Blake remained a few steps away, his gaze no longer scanning, no longer searching for confirmation, but fixed in a way that suggested he was seeing something he had missed before, something that had been there from the beginning but obscured by assumption. And the suited man shifted slightly, his attention moving between them, not directing, not interrupting, but observing with a quiet precision that held the moment together without forcing it forward. And in the background the second vehicle remained still, its presence no longer adding tension but reinforcing the shift that had already taken place. And one of the additional figures leaned lightly against the door, arms relaxed, eyes attentive, not intervening, just ensuring that what had been set into motion would not unravel. And Naomi took a slow breath, her chest rising and falling almost imperceptibly. And when she spoke again, her voice carried the same calm clarity, but this time there was something more beneath it, not emotion, not emphasis, but depth. "It is never just one moment," she said, and the words did not explain themselves. They simply existed, and Blake listened, his expression tightening slightly as if the meaning was not immediate but undeniable. And he nodded once, slower this time, not out of agreement, but recognition, and he glanced briefly at the ground, the reflections of the lights still moving across the pavement, distorted, shifting, never quite settling into one shape. And then he looked back at Naomi, his voice quieter than before. "I thought I was following procedure," he said, and the statement was not defensive. It was reflective, as if he was tracing the steps backward, trying to find the exact point where the line had shifted without him noticing. And Naomi met his gaze, her eyes steady, and for a moment she did not respond, allowing the weight of his words to settle, allowing him to hear them fully. And then she spoke, her voice soft but clear. "Procedure does not replace judgment," she said, and the sentence landed differently than anything else that had been said, not because it was louder, but because it reached beyond the moment into something larger, something that extended past the gas station, past the lights, past the people watching. And Blake exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just a fraction more, and he nodded again, this time more firmly, as if acknowledging something he could not ignore any longer. And the suited man inclined his head slightly, not adding to the exchange, not interrupting it, but recognizing its significance. and the onlookers, once drawn in by curiosity, had grown almost completely still, many no longer holding their phones up at all, their attention no longer focused on capturing but on understanding. And in the distance the faint movement of traffic continued along the highway, steady, indifferent, the world moving forward without pause. And yet here, in this small space under artificial light, something had slowed enough to be seen clearly, and Naomi shifted her weight slightly, her stance adjusting in a way that suggested the moment was no longer holding her in place, that she was free to move if she chose. But she remained where she was, not because she had to, but because the moment had not fully finished speaking, and Blake noticed the shift, his eyes following the subtle movement. And he stepped back just a little more, not retreating, but creating space, acknowledging it without words. And when he spoke again, his voice carried something new, something that had not been there before. "I am sorry," he said, and the words were simple, unembellished, but they did not feel automatic. They felt considered, deliberate, and they settled into the space between them without expectation. And Naomi looked at him, her expression unchanged, but her eyes softening just slightly, not in forgiveness, not in acceptance, but in acknowledgement that the words had been said, and that mattered. And the suited man glanced briefly toward the additional vehicles, then back to Naomi, as if confirming that everything that needed to happen here had already begun. And Naomi gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, and turned her gaze once more toward the road beyond the station, the dark stretch of highway that continued forward without hesitation. And in that quiet moment, under the steady glow of the lights and the soft hum of the night, the scene settled fully into itself, not resolved completely, not erased, but understood. And that understanding, once it took hold, did not need to be announced to be real. The apology did not disappear into the night. It remained, quiet and present, like something placed carefully between them. And Naomi Carter stood there for a moment longer, her gaze resting on Officer Blake, not with expectation, not with judgment, but with a kind of stillness that allowed the words to exist without forcing them to become anything more. And the soft hum of the gas station lights continued above, steady and indifferent, casting a pale glow across the pavement where the reflections of red and blue had begun to fade, the urgency of earlier moments dissolving into something calmer, something more grounded. And Blake did not look away this time, his posture no longer guarded, his shoulders lowered in a way that suggested he was no longer holding onto the version of the situation he had started with. And when he spoke again, it was not to explain, not to justify, but to acknowledge. "I should have listened sooner," he said, and the words carried a different weight than the apology, not broader, but deeper. And Naomi inclined her head slightly, not affirming, not dismissing, simply recognizing the shift. And the suited man remained a step behind and to the side, his presence steady, his attention quiet but unwavering, as if ensuring that what had been corrected here would not slip back into something less clear. And in the background, the additional figures near the vehicles remained still, not approaching, not retreating, their role defined not by action but by presence. And Naomi took a slow breath, her chest rising gently, and when she exhaled, the air seemed to settle further, the moment easing into something that no longer required tension to hold it together. And she glanced down briefly at her wrists, the faint marks now barely visible under the soft light, and then lifted her gaze again, her voice calm when she spoke. "It is not about sooner or later," she said. "It is about whether you see clearly when it matters." And the sentence did not carry accusation, did not reopen what had already been acknowledged. It simply placed the moment into perspective. And Blake listened, his eyes focused, his expression thoughtful. And he nodded once, slower than before, as if the meaning was settling into him piece by piece. And he stepped back another small distance, not out of discomfort, but to give the space the moment now required. And the suited man shifted slightly, his gaze moving outward again, scanning the perimeter one more time before returning to Naomi. And for a brief second, there was a quiet exchange between them, not spoken, but understood. And he gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, as if confirming that everything that needed to happen here had reached its point. And Naomi responded in kind, her posture unchanged, her calm intact. And she turned slightly toward her vehicle, the motion unhurried, deliberate, as if reclaiming the path that had been interrupted without allowing the interruption to define it. And the sound of her steps against the pavement was soft but clear, each one marking a return to something ordinary, something steady, and Blake watched her move, his gaze following not out of obligation, but out of awareness, as if he understood that the moment was not ending. It was transitioning, and when she reached the driver's side door, she paused briefly, her hand resting on the handle, and she turned back just enough to look at him once more, not lingering, not searching, just acknowledging. And then she opened the door, the interior lights spilling out softly, illuminating the quiet details inside, and she placed her bag on the seat with a controlled motion, everything about her movement consistent, measured, unchanged by what had happened. And as she settled into the driver's seat, the outside world remained still for a moment longer, as if giving her the space to move forward on her own terms. And the suited man stepped back slightly, creating a clear path, his presence no longer central, but supportive, and Blake remained where he was, his posture steady, his gaze thoughtful, and the onlookers, once drawn by curiosity, had begun to disperse quietly, their attention shifting back to their own lives, their roles in the moment complete without needing acknowledgement. And Naomi closed the door gently, the sound soft but final, and the engine started with a low, steady hum. And under the glow of the station lights, the scene settled fully into its new shape, not erased, not forgotten, but understood in a way that could not be undone. And as the headlights of her car illuminated the path ahead, the moment released its hold, allowing everything to move forward exactly as it should. The engine's low hum filled the space where tension had once lived, steady and controlled. And Naomi Carter sat behind the wheel for a moment without moving, her hands resting lightly against the steering wheel, her eyes forward but not yet focused on the road ahead, as if allowing the moment to finish unfolding around her before she chose to leave it behind. And outside the vehicle, the gas station had already begun to return to its ordinary rhythm, the overhead lights buzzing softly, the distant sound of a car pulling into a different pump, the quiet murmur of voices no longer centered on her. And Officer Blake stood near his cruiser, his posture still but no longer rigid, his gaze fixed on Naomi's car, as if trying to understand not just what had happened, but what it meant beyond the sequence of events he could explain. And the suited man remained a few steps away, his presence steady but no longer central, his role shifting from intervention to observation, ensuring that what had been corrected remained so, without needing to be reinforced. And Naomi drew a slow breath, her fingers tightening slightly on the wheel before relaxing again, a small, controlled motion that mirrored everything else about her. And she adjusted the rearview mirror with a gentle touch, the angle shifting just enough to bring the scene behind her into view. The flashing lights now dimmer, the figures smaller, the moment already beginning to recede. And for a brief second her eyes met her own reflection, calm, steady, unchanged, and she exhaled softly, not as release, not as relief, but as acknowledgement that the moment had passed through her without altering who she was. And outside, Blake took a step forward, not toward her car, but closer than before, his movement hesitant but intentional, as if something remained unfinished. And Naomi noticed the shift in the mirror, her gaze flicking briefly toward him before returning forward. And the engine continued its quiet rhythm, steady, patient, waiting for direction. And Blake stopped a few feet from the driver's side, not close enough to intrude, not far enough to disappear. And he spoke, his voice measured, carrying across the short distance without force. "Ma'am," he said, and the word held the same respect as before, but now it carried something more, something grounded in understanding rather than obligation. And Naomi turned her head slightly, just enough to acknowledge him through the open window, her expression unchanged, her presence steady. And Blake held her gaze for a moment, not searching, not questioning, but recognizing. And when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, more deliberate. "Thank you for your patience," he said, and the words were simple, but they did not feel procedural. They felt chosen. And Naomi regarded him for a brief moment, her eyes softening just slightly, and she nodded once, small, controlled, not accepting or rejecting, simply acknowledging. And she replied, her voice calm, even. "Patience should not be required for fairness. and the sentence settled between them with a quiet weight, not sharp, not accusatory, but clear, and Blake absorbed it without interruption. His expression shifting again, deeper this time, as if the meaning extended beyond the moment into something he would carry with him long after this night ended. And he nodded once more, slower now, understanding that the exchange was no longer about resolving what had happened, but about recognizing what it revealed. And Naomi turned her attention forward again, her hands settling firmly on the wheel, her posture aligning with the road ahead, and she shifted the car gently into gear. The movement smooth, unhurried, and the headlights stretched out across the pavement, illuminating the path forward in a steady beam. And the suited man stepped back another pace, clearing the space entirely now, his role complete, his presence no longer needed to hold the moment together, and the additional figures near the vehicles remained still, their attention quiet, ensuring that nothing disrupted the transition from tension to movement. And Naomi eased her foot onto the accelerator, the car moving forward slowly at first, the tires rolling softly against the concrete. And as she passed the edge of the station, the light changed, the artificial glow giving way to the darker stretch of road beyond. And in the rearview mirror the scene grew smaller, the figures blending into the background, the moment no longer holding her in place. And Blake remained where he stood, watching the car until it merged fully into the road, his posture steady, his expression thoughtful, as if the night had left something with him that could not be filed away or forgotten. And the gas station returned to its ordinary rhythm completely, the lights humming, the pumps clicking, the world continuing forward without pause. And Naomi drove on, her presence unchanged, her calm intact, the road ahead stretching out in quiet certainty, and the moment behind her settling into something that did not need to be revisited to be remembered. The road stretched out ahead in long, uninterrupted lines, the headlights carving a steady path through the darkness as Naomi Carter drove with the same calm precision she had carried through every moment before, her hands resting firmly on the wheel, her posture aligned, her breathing even, and the hum of the engine settled into a quiet rhythm that matched the pace of her thoughts, not racing, not lingering, just moving forward. And behind her the gas station had already faded into distance, its lights shrinking in the rearview mirror until they became just another glow along the roadside, indistinguishable from the rest of the night. And for a while there was only the road, the soft sound of tires against asphalt, the occasional passing headlights of other vehicles moving in the opposite direction, each one appearing briefly before disappearing again, their presence momentary, their paths separate. And Naomi's gaze remained steady, focused not on what had happened but on where she was going. And yet the moment lingered in a different way, not as tension, not as disruption, but as something processed, something understood. And she adjusted the radio dial slightly, the faint sound of a distant voice filling the car, low and steady, but she turned it down again after a moment, choosing the quiet instead, the kind of quiet that allowed clarity to settle without interference. And her fingers tapped once lightly against the steering wheel, a small, almost unconscious motion, and then stilled again. And the road curved gently, the headlights shifting with it, illuminating a new stretch of pavement that looked no different from the last, and yet carried her further away from what had already passed. And miles ahead, somewhere beyond the visible horizon, something else waited, something unrelated to the moment she had just left, something ordinary. And that was the point. The world continued, not because the moment did not matter, but because it had already taken its place within it. And Naomi exhaled slowly, her breath soft, controlled, and her eyes flicked briefly to the side mirror, then back to the road, confirming what she already knew, that nothing followed, that nothing needed to. And in that quiet confirmation there was no relief, only certainty, and she adjusted her grip on the wheel slightly, the movement subtle, aligning herself more fully with the forward motion, and the car maintained a steady speed, neither rushing nor hesitating, just moving, consistent and deliberate. And somewhere behind her, far enough to no longer be seen, the people at the gas station had returned to their own paths, their own conversations, their own versions of the night, carrying with them whatever part of the moment they had understood or misunderstood. And Officer Blake remained there longer than the others, though she did not see it, his posture still, his thoughts no longer tied to procedure, but to something less defined, something that would stay with him beyond the shift, beyond the report, beyond the next call that came through his radio. And the suited man had already stepped back into his vehicle, his role complete, his presence no longer required to hold the space together, and the additional figures had dispersed just as quietly as they had arrived, leaving no trace except the shift they had ensured would remain. And Naomi drove on, her eyes steady, her mind clear, and when she spoke, it was not to anyone else, not to be heard, but simply to mark the moment within herself, her voice soft, almost lost in the quiet of the car. "It should not take this much for things to be seen clearly," she said, and the words did not carry frustration, only truth, and she let them settle without repeating them, without expanding them, because they did not need to be more than what they were. And the road continued, mile after mile, the lines passing beneath her in a steady rhythm, and the night remained unchanged, vast and open, indifferent and constant, and Naomi remained the same within it, her presence steady, her calm intact, her direction clear, and in that quiet movement forward, the moment found its place, not as something that defined her, but as something that had passed through her without altering who she had always been. The highway stretched forward in a long, quiet line, the rhythm of the tires against the asphalt steady and unbroken as Naomi Carter continued driving through the night, her headlights cutting a narrow path through the darkness, illuminating only what was necessary and leaving the rest untouched. And inside the car the silence remained, not empty, not heavy, but complete, the kind of silence that did not need to be filled because everything that needed to be understood had already settled into place, and her hands rested firmly on the wheel, her posture unchanged, her gaze focused ahead with the same calm certainty that had carried her through every moment before. And the faint glow of distant city lights began to appear along the horizon, small at first, almost indistinguishable from the stars above, but gradually growing clearer as she moved closer, each mile bringing definition to what had once been only suggestion. And Naomi did not rush. She did not accelerate to reach it faster. She maintained her pace, steady and controlled, as if understanding that arrival was not something to chase, but something that came naturally when the direction was clear, and the memory of the gas station no longer lingered as tension or disruption. It existed now as something quieter, something resolved within her without needing to be revisited, and she adjusted her grip on the wheel slightly, the movement smooth and unforced, aligning herself with the road as it curved gently ahead. And for a brief moment her eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, not searching, not checking, just acknowledging. And there was nothing there but the fading darkness behind her, no flashing lights, no figures, no trace of what had happened except the understanding she carried forward. And she returned her gaze to the road, her expression unchanged, her calm intact, and somewhere miles behind her, at the gas station that had already returned to its ordinary rhythm, Officer Blake stood alone for a moment longer after everything had settled, his cruiser silent beside him, the overhead lights no longer flashing, and he looked down at his hands briefly, then out toward the road where her car had disappeared, and something in his posture shifted, not outwardly dramatic, but internal, a quiet recalibration of something he had not questioned before, and he reached for his radio, then paused, his hand hovering for a second before lowering it again, as if recognizing that not everything needed to be transmitted, not everything needed to be documented to matter, and the suited man had already left, his presence no longer required, the vehicles that had arrived with him gone as quietly as they had come, leaving behind no evidence except the change they had ensured would remain, and the gas station lights continued their steady hum, indifferent to what had taken place beneath them, and the world moved forward as it always did, one moment flowing into the next without pause, and Naomi drove on, the city lights ahead growing brighter now, more defined, the outlines of buildings beginning to take shape against the night sky, and she rolled down the window slightly, the cool air moving through the car, carrying with it the scent of distance, of motion, of something open and uncontained, and she closed her eyes for the briefest second, not in fatigue, not in escape, but in acknowledgement, and when she opened them again, her focus was clear, unwavering, and she continued forward without hesitation, and there was no need for reflection, no need for conclusion, because the moment had already spoken everything it needed to say. And as the road carried her into the glow of the city, her figure became part of the movement, part of the flow of everything that continued without interruption. And in that quiet progression, beneath the steady rhythm of tires and light, one truth remained, not spoken, not declared, but understood, that dignity does not arrive with recognition. It exists before it, and sometimes all it takes is one moment, seen clearly, to remind the world of what should have never been forgotten.